Welcome back, AP Psychers. In today's video, we are going to look at the first research method FRQ that was assigned over April break. The first bullet in the FRQ actually asked you about a concept from Unit 9, Developmental Psychology. So it is appropriately timed in the middle of our Unit 9 unit, and that was the term habituation. If you watched my video on habituation, you might recall that quick study that I did with my cat Darby, where I presented him with a new toy, or at least a toy he doesn't usually see, and a toy that he sees basically every single day. And you would have noticed that his attention immediately went to the toy that's usually put away and only brought out for the holidays. This study was a great representation of habituation, where the researcher presented children of different ages with the same toy over the course of 3 different trials at 3 months, 6 months, and 8 months, and then calculated how much time that child spent, how many seconds that child spent focused on that toy. If you notice, between all 5 of the children, the very first trial at 3 months was all for, in each trial, the highest quantity of time. Then once the child aged 3 months, you would notice across the board, the numbers decreased from 15 to 10, 12 to 7, so on and so forth. And then finally, in the 8-month series, you would notice the numbers reached their lowest point across the board. Habituation is the concept that the more exposure you have to a stimulus, like a toy, whether it's in the context of an infant or a dog or a cat, or whether it's the beeping noise in the background, maybe you forgot to change the batteries in your smoke detector, that the repeated exposure to a stimulus produces a waning interest or a decrease in interest, which is precisely what we saw here. One conceivable explanation for this study is that over the 3 trials, at 3, 6, and 8 months, the child habituated to the toy. Their interest waned due to repeated exposure. The second bullet asked you to briefly calculate one of the 3 central tendencies. The term central tendency is a term that may have been a new term coming into AP Psych, but you have assuredly heard of the 3 types of central tendencies: mean, median, and mode. Mean being the average, the median being the middle number, and then the mode, which is what the bullet here asked, the most frequent score within that set or that distribution. In the context of this FRQ, it asked what was the mode for the 3-month-olds. You would notice that the number 15 appears twice, meaning the mode was simply the number 15. The third bullet asked you to take a look at the dependent variable and simply identify the dependent variable, which more or less is a way of asking how to operationally define it. At least if you do operationally define it, that's sufficient to score. So if that's a skill that you're more familiar with, that would have worked here. I took a portion of the FRQ out and I quoted it here on the board because I think it's a really good skill and trick to look for words like records. I usually have mentioned to look for the word measure or measured, but record is a synonym of measured, and if you can find whether it's the word record or measure, you're more than likely looking at a description or at least the operational definition of the dependent variable. So first I want to just briefly go to this corner here in blue. The setup of this study was pretty simple. The infants were presented with a shape, the shape that the infants would be presented with numerous times over the course of the study. And then there was a calculation for how long that child shifted their interest from the shape that they're being studied to something else. And if you go back to the prompt, the exact sentence was, he, the researcher, records how long it takes the infant to show interest in the new shape. So they're looking at, let's say, a circle. You calculate how long it takes the child to then shift their attention to a triangle. And if that takes 30 seconds, that's precisely what they're calculating. In the table that I previously had on the board for the first couple FRQ bullets, those numbers were all of the quantity of seconds that it took the child to shift their attention. So precisely, the dependent variable in this FRQ was, in a sentence that could work as a single sentence answer, the dependent variable was how long it took for the children to show interest in the new shape. This is just one example. There are several different ways that you could have approached this, or at least several different sentences that you could have used. You know, the dependent variable is the time it took the children to look towards the new shape. That's sort of what I have up here. The fourth bullet is a bullet that I haven't really shown you before, at least not in this manner, but I think it's a really important bullet to see, and it's a bullet that we'll try to practice as much as we can going forward. I've recreated a small portion of the table here on the board. I've isolated only the first infant, and I've isolated here the ages. Certainly, if you look back at the FRQ, you would find infants 2 through 5. However, their results are exactly the same, or at least follow the same pattern, so I think it's unnecessary to put them on the board. This question, describe the correlation, is basically asking you, is this a positive correlation? Or, on the other hand, is this a negative correlation? A positive correlation would be a circumstance where both variables go up together. A negative correlation would be a circumstance where one variable increases while the other variable decreases. Let's take a look at these numbers. 3, 6, 8. So as age increases, so we'll add age is increasing from 3 months to 6 months to 8 months. What happens to the quantity of time that the child takes to show interest in a new shape? Well, it goes from 15 to 10 to 3. What is the direction of movement in the column here? This is a decrease. So this bullet is essentially asking you what type of correlation the data shows. In this circumstance, the data shows a negative correlation. That's all you would really have to say. The data in this study shows a negative correlation. Period. Sufficiently scoring. Because it's very simple. A negative correlation is when one variable increases, the other variable decreases. In this case, when age increases from 3 to 6 to 8, the quantity of time spent looking at the shape, or the amount of time necessary to shift interest, decreases from 15 to 10 to 3. The fifth bullet is easily the most difficult bullet of this set. I think it's reasonable to anticipate a question like this on the actual AP exam, a question that requires a really deep and well-rounded understanding of research methods. Although it's a bullet that I've presented to you before, I've never presented it to you with this caveat. Maybe some of you identified this, which is great. You should really expect that the College Board asks questions that are really designed to differentiate students that have just an off-the-charts, well-rounded, full understanding of research methods, and students that have a strong understanding, who might get 5 out of the 6 bullets instead of 6 out of the 6. Because quite frankly, you can get a 5 in either circumstance. This is a great example of a question that really requires a deep understanding of research methods. The question asks, what conclusions can you draw from the data? And more specifically, does the data back up the hypothesis made by the researcher? I've pulled out here the quote. Although it's not presented as a hypothesis, it doesn't state this is the hypothesis. This sentence, or the fragment here in this sentence, is in fact the hypothesis made by the researcher. The researcher expects that getting older will cause, that's a really key part of this, will cause the babies to recognize shapes faster. So the researcher here is trying to establish a cause and effect relationship. In order to do that, you need to conduct an experiment. And there are a couple features of experiments. The first major feature is what we call random assignment. When we take our participants and randomly divide them into a control and an experimental group. You also need to look for the manipulation of the independent variable. In this study, or at least what the researcher is presenting as an experiment, or at least some type of study, it seems like the independent variable happens to be something like age. Age is a relatively challenging topic to use as an independent variable for a few different reasons. One of the main reasons why age is a really tough independent variable to work with is you can't randomly assign. You can't have researchers randomly assign people based on age. It just doesn't work. There is a group of 3-year-olds, a group of 6-year-olds, and a group of 8-year-olds. There's no way of taking your participants and dividing them into groups. Their age is a set definitive number. And if you randomly assign, part of the reason you do that is to shuffle age. So the way the researcher is going about studying this can't show cause and effect because it can never actually, at least in the way that this FRQ is being presented, use random assignment. And you can't really manipulate an independent variable the same way that you can manipulate how much sugar you give somebody, or whether or not they receive a placebo, or this new type of pharmaceutical drug. This study simply cannot work in a manner that shows cause and effect. So because this study does not have random assignment, and because it really doesn't manipulate variables appropriately, this study is really a correlational study. It's a more sophisticated correlational study than what we've done. So this study is correlational, which means, can the researcher prove this hypothesis? The answer to that is actually no. No, the researcher, just based on what you were presented, cannot make a definitive cause statement because the researcher has failed to really design a true experiment. There's no evidence of random assignment. And even if there was, you can't really randomly assign people if the variable you're studying is age. And two, it's really hard to manipulate age. In theory, the researcher should be actively presenting the participants with something, giving them a unique experience. Age is already predetermined and simply does not work in the context of this study. The final bullet asked you about Piaget's object permanence. It didn't identify object permanence by name, but if you're familiar with Piaget, you would be able to answer this question. Piaget was focused on in Essential Task 9.4a and also in a specific video. Piaget is one of the more important names and one of the more complex names in Unit 9, so it's definitely a name that warrants our attention. One of the things that Piaget hypothesized is that children at the very beginning of the sensual motor stage, which is between the ages of 0 to 2 years, children lack what's called object permanence. And object permanence is not learned until roughly 6 to 7 months. Which would mean when a 3-year-old looks at the scenario that I have on the board, where the baseball that they are playing with is put into a box, a 3-year-old is going to believe, gone forever. So if you go back and think about the context of this study is a question of, will children shift their focus from one shape to another? Well, if an object is out of a baby's sight at 3 months, at least according to Piaget, that child has lost all connection with that toy or that shape forever. It's gone forever. They will not look for the toy. They will not seek the toy out. They will not look in the toy chest. They will not look under the pillow. They won't look in the box. The toy is gone forever. At roughly 6 months, though, children acquire, so between 3 to 8 months, approximately 6 months to be specific, object permanence is gained. Still in the early phase of the sensual motor stage, but still at a point where a 3-year-old lacks it. So by 8 months, the child will watch the ball go into the box and still think to themselves, I can look for it in the box. The child is fully aware that the ball still exists. That old phrase, out of sight, out of mind, is no longer in effect. That child can actively open the box and look for it. The child knows it's still there. The child will not shift their interest to something else. They will actively seek out that baseball if that baseball was of interest to them before it was put into the box. So if you go back and look at this bullet, in a sentence or two, it was essentially asking you to describe the fact that children at 3 months lack object permanence and therefore might not seek out the shape or the toy, while an 8-month-old, more than likely, at least according to Piaget, has acquired object permanence and their interest in these things will continue even if it is out of sight.